Welcome back, everybody. This is Paranormal Radio, and I am your host here on this Friday the 13th, Captain Jack. It's going to be a fun night tonight. It really is. I've been really looking forward to this night. My guests tonight are Noe Torres and Ruben Uriarte, and listen to this. Get ready. On a clear spring day in 1955, Air Force Reservist Robert Willingham was piloting an F-86 fighter jet across West Texas when he saw an intensely bright UFO streak past his aircraft at over about 2,000 miles per hour and then crash land along the banks of the Rio Grande River. When he later found smoldering, twisted wreckage that convinced him the object was not from this earth. This is a true story of a decorated World War II and Korean War veteran who had a UFO encounter that changed his life forever. One of America's first fighter jet pilots, Willingham, was flying one of 4 jets escorting a B-47 bomber engaged in a simulated bombing run when an object as bright as a star suddenly appeared. After pursuing it and watching it plunged to Earth along the Texas-Mexico border. Willingham visited the crash site and found strange metallic object embedded into the side of the sandy hill just south of the Rio Grande River. Now, walking in the midst of a huge debris field, he picked up and took with him a piece of metal that later proved to be unknown to Earth science. Well then, Ruben, Noe, welcome back to the program. It's good to talk to you both again.
Hey, welcome there, Captain Jack, calling from the Bay Area of San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area.
How are things out there?
It's a little cool. It's about 78 degrees, and we had our almost similar big fire. I mean, the fires here in California are a big concern.
Yes.
Especially during this time. And we had a fire right here in the Oakland, Berkeley Hills, and reminiscent of what we had back in 1991.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, the firefighters got to it sooner.
Good. That's good. And Noe, how about you? How are things in your neck of the woods?
Yes, Captain, thanks for having us on again tonight. We've been looking forward to being on the show. We've got an incredible story to share with the audience tonight. It's a story that we could hardly believe ourselves when we first came upon it.
Yes.
I'm calling in from South Texas tonight, and Ruben and I, like I said, are really looking forward to talking about this incredible case. One of the most exciting historic UFO cases that we've ever run across. So
yes.
We're happy to be on tonight. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. It's good to have you both on. So, a couple things. One of them, because we kind of got to touch on it a little briefly. You both heard the story that I talked about a little bit here at the start of the program about the Columbia. What do you guys think about that?
We were really amazed to hear that. I hadn't heard very much about this, and starting off your show, one of the things that I focused in on, because it also happens to be a factor, it was believed to have been a factor perhaps in the Colonel Willingham UFO encounter that we're going to talk about tonight. That is the possible use of directed particle beam weaponry or plasma weaponry that is of course theoretical, and it hasn't been proven to be effective in the scale that some folks say it is.
Yes.
But there was that possibility that there was the involvement of a plasma or particle beam weaponry in the downing of the UFO that Colonel Willingham saw back in the 50s that we're going to talk about tonight. So that immediately kind of brought it all home to me, that tie-in as far as the plasma weaponry.
Well, that's very, very interesting, because the whole lead-up, something that's kind of surrounding this whole thing with the Columbia is there's some people that believed that we're kind of caught in the middle of, in a sense, some sort of two interstellar species war of some type. That they're actually warring with each other. We're kind of caught in the middle of it all. And I don't know all the details of that, but that's what I'm gathering from this story.
Well, we've heard of other cases, other similar theories that this is going on. I guess that's the question: is who's shooting down who?
Yes.
And we had a real interesting event that happened here back in 1964, Captain Jack, right here close to Vandenberg Air Force Base, and this was actually filmed where we had Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jacobs, who at that time was assigned to Vandenberg Air Force Base, and they launched the missile, and they caught on film UFO that actually knocked out the missile.
Yes.
So back in '64, lasers were in their infancy.
Right.
But then again, here we have our weapons, and of course, you had flyovers of UFOs over missile silos over Malmstrom Air Force Base back in the '60s, and shutting down missiles, and so this gets really fascinating.
Well, there's been a lot of cases where we know that UFOs have affected the weapon systems of military aircraft that have approached them in the past. There have been a number of cases, such as the famous case from the 70s of the Iranian jets that approached the UFO, and suddenly all their weapon systems and guidance systems went offline for a while. So we've known that the UFO encounters a lot of times lead to some kind of electromagnetic interference of the weapon systems that our forces have. Now, by the same token, it's possible. We have suspected that UFOs themselves are a lot of times disturbed. Perhaps their guidance systems, their navigation systems are disturbed by some of the forces emanating from Earth, perhaps intentionally or not intentionally, or even from other sources. The scenario that we've looked at before is that there are factions within these UFO entities that are at war with each other, and that they often they basically wreak havoc to each other's craft, resulting in a lot of times in the downing of UFOs in the various crash scenarios that we've all heard about, including the one that we'll be speaking about tonight.
Right.
It's a very interesting theory.
Well, tell me a little bit about who Robert Willingham is.
Robert Willingham is an amazing gentleman that we ran across about 2 years ago. We were wrapping up the research for our first book, Mexico's Roswell, the Chihuahua UFO Crash, which is a story of the 1974 crash of a UFO in a small plane near the Big Bend country of West Texas.
Yes.
And we've been on your show a couple of times before talking about that incident in 1974, where there was a recovery made by an elite recovery team out of Fort Bliss, Texas, in El Paso. And eventually the crashed UFO was brought back to the U.S. and was taken, we can only speculate where, for further analysis and whatever it is they do with captured UFOs.
Right.
But anyway, we were working the case and we were finalizing the research for our book. We had gone down to Chihuahua, Mexico several times and talked to witnesses down there. We were working with the History Channel on the recent UFO Hunters segment, which featured our book, the Crash and Retrieval segment that ran last February.
Right.
And in the midst of all this, even long before this, we had been hearing talk that there was another UFO crash that had occurred many years ago, much earlier to 1974, generally in the same area of Southwest Texas. People were telling us, and we were running across evidence of an incident near Del Rio, Texas, in the 50s. And in fact, some people were claiming that the Eisenhower briefing document, the famous document that also mentions the 1947 crash of a UFO near Roswell, New Mexico,
right,
it mentions a UFO crash near Del Rio. Also, those are the only two specific crash retrievals that document mentions.
Huh.
So one of the people that really started cluing us into what was going on with Colonel Willingham is one of the world's foremost UFO researchers, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who actually helped guide the writing of our book. He served as our mentor through the whole process. He helped us out to make sure that we were staying on course with it, and he proved an invaluable help to us. Anyway, he was the one that told us that there was this former Air Force jet pilot from Texas who had this UFO incident in the 50s, and he himself, Colonel Willingham himself, had actually seen the UFO crash and then had visited the site where the crash had taken place, and he had recovered some of the debris from that. So that's how we got started, and through a series of circumstances which we're most thankful to Dr. Maccabee for, we ended up making contact with Colonel Willingham, who is 82 years old now, living near Wichita Falls, Texas, but he's in excellent health in terms of his recall. He has very sharp memory and recall, and we have interviewed him for hours about this amazing case, which we'll be talking about more later. But that's how the whole thing started, with finding out what this incident was about, locating Colonel Willingham, still alive, very sharp recall still, and then that triggered the whole incident, the whole research that went into our latest book called The Other Roswell.
Yes. So he was on training maneuvers at the time that this happened, that he saw this thing crash into the bank of the Rio Grande? Was it?
Well, Colonel Willingham himself has an amazing resume in terms of his military career and so forth.
Yes.
And Ruben, why don't you give us kind of an overview of, we've spent a lot of time with him. He has shared with us his scrapbooks and his photographs of his military service. And Ruben knows all the ins and outs of his military career. Why don't you give us a little of that?
Oh, well, I like to preface that. I just wanted to kind of give the audience first of what was going on back in the 50s and how this really tied in Willingham, and then we'll go right into his bibliography there and somewhat. But we'll have to go back right during the 50s, right when we were in the middle of the Cold War, where you had Russia and the United States testing the hydrogen bomb, the atomic bomb, and then to the hydrogen bomb, and then there were a movement of developing more nuclear weapons. And one of the interesting things as we were doing this research, Captain Jack, was that what I found really fascinating, and this kind of ties into this whole thing about particle beam weapons and knocking down the aircraft. There was actually the government had ordered our military to go ahead and shoot down UFOs back in the early 50s.
Yes.
They had orders to go ahead and shoot them down if they refused to land. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But we were looking at statistically, and I mentioned this before. I mean, I find this really fascinating. One of the researchers, his name is Frank Ficino. He came up with a book last year called Shoot Down, and statistically, he started to take a look at what was going on during the Korean War and in the post-Korean War. And during the Korean War, it started in 1950, and then in 1953, we had approximately 104 fighter planes that were shot down in Korea. Okay, so, but in 1951 through 1956, this was over 185 fighter aircraft were lost over the United States.
Wow. And
its coastal waters from 1951, 1956. So that means over close to 199 aviators were lost, or they labeled the incidents as accidents. Yet these were the pilots that were ordered to shoot down UFOs, and as a result, these guys were well-seasoned fighter pilots, Captain Jack, just like Willingham. They were World War II vets and Vietnam vets, and these guys were ordered to go fly against an unknown and never came back.
Yes.
Of course, we had a number of incidents that were going on with the number of civilian airplanes were also lost. So that's a whole fascinating period. Where this ties in with Willingham, when Noe and I met with him, we were just amazed at this man's experience. He, like Noe had mentioned, he was raised in Texas, and his family lived during the big booming period of the oil refineries and drilling that was going on during that time. And then he later joined the military. He joined the 82nd Airborne, and they landed in Normandy. Of course, he was an engineer.
Uh-huh.
And then later, after the war, he was a provost marshal in Berlin and Munich, and later he was a pilot. He flew airplanes in his civilian life, and then later, when the part of the Army transitioned into what became later as the United States Air Force, he later was assigned to fly P-51 Mustangs, and they provided strafing missions over, helping our troops back in the Korean War. Well, he himself was injured and was hospitalized in the Tokyo hospital in Japan. Later, he joined after he was hospitalized and he recovered from his wounds, which later we found out that there were some consequences as a result of his injuries.
Uh-huh.
He joined the Air Force Reserve, and this goes right now into the actual mission of 1955, where they were flying escort for a group of B-47 bombers and the earlier versions of B-52s over Texas during a Cold War exercise where these bombers would simulated flights over the United States, similar so that for their bombing runs over Russia. So
what it was.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could cut in there, what it was this was a period of high tension between the USSR and America, of course.
Right.
And what we had a nuclear retaliatory strike response planned out. So what these bombers would do is they would fly across the U.S. up the West Coast, and if it had been a real mission, they would have continued on into Western Canada and then on to the USSR by way of Alaska.
Yes.
And the Bering Strait. So Colonel Willingham was in one of the fighter jets that was escorting the bombers as they were making the simulated nuclear bombing raid headed toward the Soviet Union. So his part of it was he and 3 other fighter jets were escorting the bombers, one particular bomber, a B-47, across Texas headed to El Paso. From El Paso, then the bomber would then turn northwest to go up the west coast of the U.S. up toward Canada. So, and this was something that was done on a regular basis just to keep everybody sharp and to, prepare for the possibility that if we were struck by the Soviet Union, that we would have a nuclear response against them.
Sure.
Deliver weapons into the heart of the USSR in response. So this was a type of mission that Colonel Willingham was involved in because he no longer had clearance to fly combat missions because of his injury sustained in Korea.
I gotcha.
And so therefore he transferred over. He was still a fantastic pilot, and he continued to serve and continued to have flight time almost close to the 1970s. So he still flew for about 20 more years after his Korean injury.
Mm-hmm.
And he was involved later on. As we get deeper into the story, he later became a member of the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was the unit assigned to investigate UFO sightings. And he actually took part in hundreds of Project Blue Book investigations.
Oh, really?
And that happened after his own UFO encounter. So that's a fascinating angle.
That is very fascinating angle indeed. Yes. So he wasn't alone whenever he was on this training mission. There were others that obviously another pilot and of course the ones that were flying the bomber plane. Yes.
There were
a
great number. Yes. Go ahead, Ruben.
So that's what we're hoping. Is that we might be able to get additional witnesses, and any of those with, hopefully, although they're probably in their 80s now,
yes.
Many of those that had served on that particular day, if we could have them to, we have someone who could then share with us and verify that this actually happened. Of course, it was just to further strengthen our investigation.
Right.
But based on all the information that Willingham has given us, we just have no doubt this guy, he's of that era of the right stuff.
Yes,
Captain Jack.
Indeed.
Yeah, he definitely. He's of that cut.
And, I've noticed something that now, at this time, like whenever I was talking with Steve Allen from Stephenville, Texas, about the lights and everything, they had this town hall meeting. He said people came from all over, and there were a lot of guys that were from the World War II area, guys in their 80s, reaching their 90s, mid-90s, and they came forward and they said straight out, they said, hey, let me tell you about my stories. Let me tell you about some of the stuff that I know, and they say...
That's so interesting. That is so interesting that you say that, because every time that Ruben and I speak, either together or a lot of times we'll speak in our own areas by ourselves.
Yes.
Every time we have a session in which we talk about these historic UFO cases, there is at least one amazing UFO story told to us.
Yeah.
Including recently, I spoke here at South Texas College here in South Texas, in McAllen, and there was a World War II veteran that came up to me. He waited until the end of my talk,
right,
and then he came up and he told me about a mission in which he was involved. He was flying along with a group of other aviators, and they saw this bright circular object approach their aircraft. And everybody, he said they were taking a group of VIPs from the West Coast to the East Coast.
Oh, well,
and,
hold on.
And
you know what? Let me stop you right there.
I'm sorry.
I'm at the top. I got to take a quick break. We're going to pick it up right from that point when we come back. So stay where you are, everybody. This is Paranormal Radio. I'm Captain Jack. My guests Ruben and Noe are here tonight to talk about the Other Roswell. Stick around. We shall return. But for me, it's always a good day, and today is an especially good day because I have Ruben and Noe with me. We've had them on the program many times before, talking about Mexico's Roswell. Fascinating story out of 1974 about the UFO colliding with a civilian aircraft, not a passenger plane, but a little Cessna-like plane. Fascinating stuff. They came out with another book called The Other Roswell. And it's about a UFO crash on the Texas-Mexico border. Robert Willingham, a pilot of a F-86 fighter jet, saw this thing crash into the riverbanks of the Rio Grande River. He went back to the location and found wreckage. Amazing stuff. He is also part of Blue Book. That's a great facet to this story. Now, just before the break, we were talking about, these older guys, 80s, 90s, that were pilots or just in the military in some form or fashion, or even just in the area, living in a particular area. They can tell you stories about UFO crashes. They can tell you about UFO experiences, all this stuff. And Noe was telling us that at some of their conferences, after they give the speech, they have people that come up to them and start telling them some fascinating stories. They're getting up there in age, and I have actually had one guy tell me, what are they going to do to me? I'm like 95 years old. What the heck are they going to do to me now? Back then, they could have killed me or threw me in the clink forever, but what the heck are they going to do to me now? And I think that's why they come forward. So, fascinating stuff. We're going to talk more about this. So, Ruben, Noe, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you. Just to pick up on what we were talking about right before the break, it's very important to study these historic UFO cases. A lot of times people will tell us, will ask us why we're not looking at more recent UFO events. Well, we're definitely also looking at recent UFO events, such as the Stephenville, Texas sightings earlier this year,
yes,
and the Chicago O'Hare sightings, and numerous other cases. But it's also important to not forget about the events that happened in the past, because as we were talking about earlier, a lot of times it takes time for individuals to muster up the courage to arrive at a place in their lives where they feel comfortable or confident to finally speak out about what they saw during their military careers.
Right.
Sometimes they have to put time, a certain length of time behind them until circumstances are right in their lives for them to speak. One of the things that we found with Colonel Willingham is that he received a great amount of psychological intimidation and bullying immediately after the event happened. Not just him, but everybody that saw this UFO, all his fellow aviators who were on that same mission, they were all debriefed after they saw this amazing event develop right before their eyes, right in front of them,
yes,
as they flew over the skies of West Texas. They were all debriefed and told that they were never to speak to anyone about what they had seen that day over Texas. So there comes a time when, in a person who has had an experience like this, and we've had, Ruben and I have both had individuals, former military, who have come up to us after our presentations and have spoken to us about their own UFO sightings. I was telling you all right before the break that recently I gave a presentation at South Texas College in McAllen, Texas, and retired Navy gentleman came up to me and told me about being on board an airplane with about 30 other military personnel and VIPs who were flying from the West Coast to the East Coast when they were approached very closely by a huge, bright disc.
Yes.
And everybody on board the plane was looking out the windows at this amazing sight hovering right in front of them. And then it just suddenly zoomed away in a couple of seconds. It was gone straight up into the sky,
yes,
above them. And then, I had a couple of other similar experiences happen to me after presentations I've done just here in my own area, here in South Texas where I live. So, in the case of Colonel Willingham, we have some voice clips that we would like to put on for your audience, Captain.
You bet.
If you've got those handy. We're going to talk about this amazing story and just kind of take it through chronologically and then fill in with additional commentary about the experience that he went through.
Yes.
As we go along. And we started off with a clip called The Initial Sighting, which kind of sets the stage for everything else that followed and how the whole UFO encounter kind of took place back in 1955.
Yes.
Somewhere in the vicinity of San Angelo, Texas, as Colonel Willingham was piloting this F-86 fighter jet that was escorting a B-47 bomber along with 3 other F-86s. Everybody on board all the aircraft saw this luminous disc fly right in front of them, and they were all later debriefed, as we were talking about a moment ago. But can we listen to that clip?
Yeah, is
Initial
that
sighting?
Yeah, just give me the duration of that. That's the 14-second long one, yes?
Give me just 1 second. I want to make sure that. Yeah, this is I don't have the length here in front of me. Oh, I'm sorry. This is 53 seconds.
53 seconds. Oh, yes, I have it right here. Let me just cue that up here real quick.
All right.
Just eject that. Put that up there, and where'd it go? Try that again. There we go. All right, it's all queued up. I'll play that now. Bear with me 1 second.
Okay, we'll go ahead and hear that, and then we'll kind of
Here we go.
that.
Yeah, we were in Texas. The aircraft that we were flying cover for was out of New York. We had some B-52s we was flying cover for, and B-47. We were going across there, and one of the bomber pilots called me and he said, "What is that you see up in front of us there, up about another 20 degrees?" And I looked up there, and it was a great big, looked like star, you know. And I said, no, that's not no star. And about that time, it made a 90-degree turn to the right, and doing about 2,000 miles an hour. And I knew that wasn't no airplane.
One of the things that is important to keep in mind, here's a gentleman who rose up the ranks of the military to become a colonel.
Yes.
He was one of the nation's first jet fighter pilots. When the military transitioned, the Army, the Air Force was split off from the Army, and he was in that group that made the transition from the Army to the U.S. Air Force. Uh-huh. And he had logged thousands of hours of jet fighter training and missions, and he knew what aircraft capabilities were, and he knew, he immediately knew that this was, as he said on the tape we just heard, this was no aircraft.
Right. Yeah, and that's the first thing he said is, it's not a star, and the fact that it makes a 90-degree turn as well,
His description of it as a star is pretty striking. He says that it was a star-shaped. Mm-hmm. It was a star-like object, like you would look through a telescope and look at a star, but very close up, very bright, almost like the sun, but very close up, star-shaped, and zooming very quickly past the formation of aircraft right in front of them.
Whoa.
And Ruben, do you want to point out why it's significant in terms of what the position of Willingham's jet was at the time of the sighting? That was a very significant part of this.
Exactly, because one of our interview questions was we asked him, well, how do F-86 fighters, how do they protect bombers? And so he says, so what he did was he drew a picture of the B-47 bomber, and he was on the left-hand side, and he had a plane on his rear, his wingman, basically.
Yes.
And on the right-hand side, basically the same thing, another lead aircraft with his wingman behind him. So basically formed like a box, protective box over the bomber. And so he was on the left-hand side, and he had full plane view of this object as it came close over the bomber formation and over his jet fighters. So he had that perfect view of it, and then and he was able to fly off toward the object and saw it descend.
Huh.
The object came blazing in from the northwestern part of the United States. It had actually triggered an alert up near Canada, the distant early warning radar system in mid Canada and southern Canada. It had triggered an alarm up there. Colonel Willingham says that the aviators on board his group of aircraft heard on the radio, come across the radio, an urgent call about a fast-moving, unidentified aircraft coming in from northwestern United States headed down toward Texas. And it was just a matter of seconds because of the speed at which this object was traveling. It was just a matter of seconds after that warning was issued over the radio that the team he was with made actual eye contact with the object as it streaked in from the northwest. Mm-hmm. So it was picked up. It was headed roughly to the east-southeast at the time that it was first picked up. Big old fireball streaking across the sky. And because of the positioning of the four fighter jets, Willingham was the one that was closest to the object up at the point to the left of the bomber. And he saw it streak past. He was closest to it. And then he saw it execute a flawless 90-degree turn without any sort of a slowdown.
Wow. And
he was the one that had something that was, totally different from the rest of his group. He had an extremely high level of interest in UFOs. He had heard about other cases. He had even had a UFO case that happened with somebody he knew at a very early age in his life.
Yes.
So he had a high level of interest. which the other members of the group apparently didn't, because he was the one that asked for and received permission to chase the UFO, to break from the formation. He was given permission to chase it, and as we'll hear here in the next couple of clips, he was the one who actually went after it and was able to make an investigation into it.
Okay. What's the next duration?
Now we're going to listen to kind of a more detailed description that he gave us. It's a 23-second clip where he describes the big bright light and exactly what it looked like as it passed the formation of aircraft.
All right.
In front of them.
All right, let me see. Let me get that loaded up there, and here it comes. Now, there's two 23-second ones. Since they're all named the same, I'm going by the durations now. If I get this one, if this isn't the right one, just let me know, and I'll switch it over, okay?
Okay.
The bomber pilot called me and asked me what it was. And by his radar, he could tell it was coming his way. Just a big bright light. Yeah, it come on over, I guess probably in about 35, 40 miles of us, and made a 90-degree turn to the right.
That is correct. Now, once again, he gives an extremely bright light, the extremely fast speed, and the sudden turn of the object right in front of them. And Willingham received permission from the, he radioed asking for permission to pursue, and he was told by the person who was acting as the commander of his group that, yes, definitely they wanted to know what the heck that was.
Yes. And
they gave him permission to break off from the rest of the group and follow this object down south, because when it made that 90-degree turn, it was now headed toward the Texas-Mexico border, and traveling at such a high rate of speed, it was going to make it there fairly quickly.
Yeah,
so
indeed.
At that point, Willingham broke off and followed and gave pursuit. We're going to listen to one now where he suddenly noticed that the UFO was having difficulty maintaining level flight.
Okay.
Was beginning to descend, and he thought he saw sparks coming out of the thing.
Okay.
And this is the one that is.
I guess, Captain, try to envision yourself in the cockpit of a F-86, and you're looking out through your plexiglass cockpit. Excuse me. And you have your gun sight, and you see this thing out there just coming right in front of your plane.
Yeah, and then make that, and then it just head off in another direction, and then you decide to chase it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd want to, but that's a pretty brave maneuver, especially from, what you said at the beginning of the program. What we kind of talked about is, there are pilots out there that have been assigned to chase these things, and a lot of them didn't come back from doing that.
Absolutely. This was a time when all that was happening.
Yeah.
We were losing a lot of aircraft from chases. But, Willingham told us that he was determined in his mind to find out something about what made these things run.
Yes.
He wanted to know more about them. He had heard about them. He had known fellow aviators who had, encountered them, and he himself wanted to find out. He had this intense curiosity.
Yes.
So we have this 41-second clip where he tells us that, he saw the object start to have trouble maintaining level flight. Let's see if we can hear that one.
Okay, sure.
41
Here
seconds.
it comes.
I seen where it hit while I was flying. And I told the commander I was going to fly over it and come back. And they said, okay, yeah, we want to know what it was. So I flew over and looked over it. And I got down about 800 feet, and you're not allowed to do that, And anyway, I got down there where I could see what I wanted to see and got out and come on back, picked my B-47 up, and they were going on to state of Washington. And I told him, I said, I got to get out of here and go home.
So he was eager to get back as quickly as possible so he could turn in his jet and return in a smaller plane. After he confirmed visually that the object had gone down right near the vicinity of Del Rio, Texas, he saw the thing hit, and he was eager to get back as quickly as possible and return in a small plane that could land in the close confines that the terrain there would allow.
Yes.
So that's why he said that he wanted to get back home as quickly as possible. Now, the second 23-second clip goes right along with that one that we just heard, and it mentions that he saw some sparks before the UFO crash. Do you have that one there, Captain?
Yeah, I got that one. Here, let's cue that one up for you.
Well, the way I kind of thought the way it looked and what happened, it was coming across there and it made a 90-degree turn at 2,000 miles an hour. And I said, that's nothing blowing in dust. There was a lot of sparks, looked like, and it tilted down about a 45-degree angle till it hit the ground.
So here we have it coming in at a 45-degree angle, sparks coming off of it until it hit the ground.
Now, all of this ties into what you started off your program with, Captain, because we've gone over with Colonel Willingham a lot of times. We've been speculating about what it was that might have caused this object to crash eventually.
Yes.
And one of the theories that we came up with, that we talked about, and we included some speculation about it in our book, is that UFO may have already been chased at some point on its route across the U.S. It might have been chased by either U.S. military aircraft along the way, or perhaps there was another object unseen to Willingham and his group that had given chase to it at some point. You know, you were talking about how there might be different factions of these UFO occupants that are not friendly toward each other.
Right.
Perhaps this object had been fired upon earlier in its trajectory across the U.S. is the speculation there.
That's an interesting perspective of it, and that leads me to a question. I mean, if he was able to get back and drop off his plane and then get in his own personal plane and fly back out there, if this thing was tracked on radars, they knew it was coming. They had he's in the military. He asked his commander if he could break off and chase this thing. I would think that they would dispatch a military retrieval team to go get this thing, but they didn't. Did they?
Well, that's a good.
That's coming up, huh?
That is the whole question.
Yeah, because we get hints of that as we go into the next phase there of his when he was able to fly back in an Aranca. This was a trainer version that they had back then, a small little propeller type Cessna type aircraft.
Yes.
And then of course the clue is that when he arrives, that he was met by Mexican military personnel. They already had the wreckage surrounded by military troops.
I see.
And, I was going to ask you, was there another sound clip you wanted to go to?
Well, let's pursue what you just said, Ruben, because this is a key point.
Yeah.
He arrives at the scene a few hours later after turning in his jet back to Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. Willingham turns in his jet. He goes to the local Civil Air Patrol headquarters there near Fort Worth, where he's a member of, and he picks up this small plane that's a propeller-driven plane that's used for pilot training. It has no lights of any kind, no radio. It's strictly for daytime pilot training.
Yes.
So he and another man pilot this down, very slow aircraft. They pilot it down to the Del Rio area, to where they saw the object, where Willingham saw the object crash. And by the time he arrives there, the crashed UFO has been, the area around it has been secured by Mexican military. And the Mexican military tells Willingham that they are waiting for the arrival of a U.S. retrieval team from the U.S. Air Force.
Oh, so they were. Oh, very interesting.
So they were under orders to cordon off the area and secure it, awaiting transferal of crashed material to the U.S. Air Force team that was coming in. And Colonel Willingham told us that he later found out that the Mexicans had been warned to stand by, that something was about to crash in that general area before the crash even occurred.
Huh. So that means that whoever warned them knew that this thing was going to be going down.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's certainly what it leads us to believe, that there was some action taken along the way that ensured that this UFO was going to come down somewhere in that vicinity.
And here's something key that Willingham had shared with us. He said he didn't observe any trucks. All he observed were just Jeeps and civilian-type vehicles. So they arrived there quickly, and we speculated that there was a military garrison that probably came out of the Ciudad Acuna. Is that correct there, Noe?
Yeah, Ciudad Acuna.
Which is about, I believe, 100 miles from...
Well, in terms of air miles, it's not too far, but it's a very rugged terrain to go over. Yeah. Wouldn't be a problem for military vehicles. Jack, can we cue up the 43-second clip where Colonel Willingham described his eagerness to go and visit the crash site?
Yes.
43 seconds?
43 seconds, got it right here, playing it right now.
And about that time, it made a 90-degree turn to the right, and doing about 2,000 miles an hour, and I knew that wasn't no airplane, and went on over there a little bit, and I said, when we get through here, I'm going to go look at that. And so they went on to Washington, state of Washington, and another fighter escort picked them up over there about the line of Arizona, and I turned around and went back to Fort Worth, and then I got in a small plane and went down there where that thing looked like it crashed.
Yeah, he really wanted to get back and see that thing again.
Mm-hmm.
Don't blame
You know who
him.
he sounds like, Noe? It just dawned on me. He reminds me of Chet Yeager.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, he was that same cut, the same model. I mean, the same type of persona.
So I had a question. So where it went down, where it crashed, it would make sense that they would dispatch Mexican military because they could get to the location before anybody else could because of where it was at. Yes.
That's exactly right. Yeah. But the interesting thing was that historically, and we've spoken about this on your show before when we were discussing the Roswell incident in 1974.
Yes.
Historically, Mexico have cooperated on the retrieval of military hardware that has gone astray and fallen into northern Mexico in and around the same general area of northern and northeastern Mexico. There have been numerous incidents where U.S. missiles have gone off course during the missile testing era of the 40s, 50s, even on to the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. In fact, there was even a case of a U.S. ICBM with nuclear material in its warhead that went down in Durango, Mexico, in northern Mexico, not that far really from this area that we're talking about with the Willingham case. So, I mean, we have a historical precedent for cooperation at higher levels of government between the U.S. and Mexico regarding the retrieval of downed military hardware in northern Mexico. And certainly this could have been the cover story that is used for an object that is coming out of down out of the Earth's atmosphere and crashing on Earth. That is typical cover story, or an easy cover story would be that it is a military satellite, missile, or experimental craft of some kind, and that would pave the way for a recovery effort by the U.S. of its own military hardware.
Yeah, and it would suggest to me, I mean, whenever they put satellites up, especially in the 50s and 60s, whenever they put these satellites up there, they didn't arm them with any type of like heat shields that we have on the shuttle for re-entry, so it doesn't burn up. And satellites, they're really, you know, some of them are pretty big. Some of them can be as big as a bus sometimes. But whenever some of these things come in, the material just gets obliterated from coming into the Earth's atmosphere.
Well,
so
what's interesting,
this size, I mean, this how big was he? How big did he speculate that this thing could have been?
Well, this leads us to a couple of very interesting clips, and we can kind of run them back to back if we can.
Yeah.
There is a where he describes the crash scene, and I think this is going to shed a lot of light on the subject. There is a 16-second clip.
Yes.
And then there's an 18-second clip that we can listen to back to back, and then we're going to hear more from the colonel about what he saw and where the crash location was.
Okay, Ruben, yeah. You were going to say something. I kind of cut you off there. Did you want to throw that in quick?
Oh, I'll wait after this.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Here we go.
You go to Judge Roy Bean's place and come toward the river till you can see all the way across the river. And it looked due south and about 10 degrees to the left. That's the way it went in.
All right.
Okay,
and then
now we've got the second one?
Yeah, we'll throw the second one here now.
The river comes up there within, I'd say 3/4 or a mile back toward Judge Roy Bean's place. And it was just hit just about 100 feet on the other side of the river.
Okay, so he keeps referring to this location known as Judge Roy Bean's place.
Yes.
Now, anyone that's lives in Texas, most everybody who lives in Texas or is familiar with Texas history knows this as it's a very historic site in the state of Texas. Judge Roy Bean was a very colorful, kind of offbeat Western era figure back in the late 1900s in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He was a justice of the peace who pretty much ruled with an iron hand there in that area near Del Rio, Texas. And he was kind of, he came from a less than clean background himself. He had some run-ins with the law and had been accused of murder at one point. But anyway, he ended up moving to Texas, and he became a justice of the peace, and he was known for some really offbeat and strange legal decisions because he had had no kind of legal training or formal training himself anyway. So the state's Department of Transportation has set up this huge tourist center, travel center there in this tiny little town of LANGTRY, Texas. And so this huge place, which is Judge Roy Bean's saloon and courthouse. It was a combination saloon and courthouse, which
Great
tells
combination.
you a little. It tells you a little something about the nature of this gentleman. But anyway, that they have preserved the structures where he held court and so forth. So anyone familiar with this area of Texas, of course, would know Judge Roy Bean's place. That he saw, Colonel Willingham saw this crash occur right there, just south along the Rio Grande River, just south of Judge Roy Bean's place. And now we get to his description of what the crash site and the Mexican soldiers that were cordoning off the object and the debris. So we have a clip that's 35 seconds in length that we can start off with.
All
there.
Right. Here we go.
I'd say there was probably a platoon of them, enlisted type, and the rest of them were government and officers. And there was about 15 or 20 of them. And I got to talk to one of the guys. Yeah, they were just looking at everything, and because it was still red hot and early, and they were staying back pretty close. I told one of them, I said, they better not grab a hold of that. That stuff's still red hot.
So it's definitely metal.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And Ruben has an interesting story about what those Mexican soldiers were doing on the day was kind of cold. And Ruben, do you want to tell that one?
Yeah, I thought this was real fascinating. That what the colonel shared with us. That when he was getting closer to the wreckage, he saw a couple of the soldiers grabbing their blankets and putting it close to the metal or on the metal itself, heating up the blankets and then wrapping the blankets around themselves. Yeah, nice. So and then he warned them. He said, "How do you know? That could be dangerous. It could be radioactive. You know." But that's what they were doing.
They didn't care.
They were keeping warm.
Yeah.
These poor guys just saw it as a way to get warm. They didn't think very far ahead.
Yes.
So now the description of the wreckage is very, very interesting because he told us that the object was roughly saucer shaped. Actually, there was two parts to it. There was what we normally would call the flat saucer section, and then there was a dome above that, a dome section. Approximately, the dome was about 10 to 15 feet in diameter, and the bottom, or the flat saucer section, was maybe 20 to 25 feet by the colonel's estimate in diameter. The two major pieces separated out. In other words, the dome part broke off and it went farther ahead or beyond where the bottom or flat saucer section had broken off, and it stayed, and then the dome section went forward quite a bit beyond, maybe 50 feet beyond where the bottom section went, the dome went. And the bottom part broke up into several large sections. There were two large sections that were partly bed and sand, but then there was a lot of shiny metallic debris all around. In fact, at one point we were talking to the colonel, and he said, just imagine that someone has taken an aluminum building, like an aluminum shed, and cut it all up into small metal strips, just cut it up into shreds, and then taken that and just dropped it from an airplane over a wide area.
Wow.
And that would be what it looked like there at the scene.
Captain, I just want to ask you, how much time do we have remaining? Because we have a lot to share, but we want to make sure we maximize the time there.
We have approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We have about 15 minutes till we get to the top of the hour, and then we have to take a break. But we still have a little bit of time left.
So what was fascinating was that we shared with the colonel this amazing new technology that allows you to zoom in on various satellite maps and so forth. And using the satellite imagery with him, he was able to pinpoint down to the very exact place where he saw this object. And when he landed that small plane, after he turned in his jet and went down there, he landed his small plane, the Aranca, right alongside the Rio Grande River, and he pointed out to us on the satellite imagery exactly where the track or the path that was made by the impact of the UFO on that day. It's amazing how vivid these memories are in his mind. Yes. I mean, he can talk to you about smells, colors of uniform. He can talk about flight paths, procedures, things that he saw. You know, it's very clearly something that made such a tremendous impression on his mind that he has carried it with him and it has haunted him for all these years. And in fact, later on, when he spent several years in Project Blue Book investigating other UFO incidents that other people had, in mind, what I think he was really doing was kind of reliving and wanting to bring closure to his own UFO experience that he had earlier in his military career.
Yes.
Because he told us that he investigated some pretty darn interesting cases. And, Project Blue Book, when it finally shut down in the late 60s, and there was this report that said that there was the Air Force found no real cause for any concern, and there was not a national security issue. Most everything in Project Blue Book supposedly was a misidentification of just regular things with stars and things like that. But yet Willingham tells us that of the hundreds of cases that he personally was an investigator for Project Blue Book on, that over 50% of them he would estimate had no conventional explanation.
Really? Wasn't the official 5% that didn't have conventional explanation?
Well, that's what a lot of people associated with Project Blue Book wanted everybody to think.
Yes.
But it was a tiny percentage. But other people who have looked at all the Project Blue Book released files say that the actual percentage of cases that had no conventional explanation was probably closer to 40%.
Wow.
30 to 40%. And because a lot of the explanations that were put out there by Project Blue Book were so ridiculous and unscientific that they have not stood the test of times in terms of being credible.
Yes.
So I think a reassessment has been made on a lot of the Blue Book files, and it's probably in the 30 to 40% range in terms of cases that are totally unexplained coming out of just a small number of cases that Project Blue Book released to the public. Because Project Blue Book was really primarily a public relations campaign to allay the fears of American citizens that there were unidentified aircraft all over our skies flying without it, with impunity. And so it was really just a PR campaign. There were a lot of cases, including Willingham's 1955 encounter there near Del Rio, Texas. There were a lot of cases that never made it into the Blue Book files because those were held as a closely guarded secret deep within military intelligence, and those files were never released into the Blue Book PR files.
Right, indeed. Well then, I agree with that wholeheartedly. The fact that the way that it was done, the way that it was released, and the way that it was supposedly closed, and the fact that they've never had another one, or they've never re-looked at it with more modern technology and a better understanding of science, just says to me that that's exactly what it was. There's absolutely without a doubt that it was nothing more than Blue Book PR program, because a lot of people were freaked out. We had the War of the Worlds broadcast where really scared people. People were seeing things. It was nothing more than trying to play damage control and shut everything down and ease concerns, indeed.
Well, see, Colonel Willingham became a Project Blue Book investigator, and yet he knew, in his mind, what had happened to him. He had seen a UFO, he had seen it crash, he had picked up some of the crash debris, held it in his hands, had it tested, and all this, and there was absolutely no mention of him or his case anywhere in the Project Blue Book files that he himself later worked on.
Yes.
So, I mean, he was aware that everything is not as it appears. And we have a real interesting clip next, Jack, if we could have it. There's a 31-second clip on the debris that he saw at the UFO crash site.
Yes. Let me see here. Let me just get that loaded into my deck. Let me just ask this. Whenever you say that he actually, and I don't want to jump too far ahead. I mean, if I throw the flow of telling the story out of whack, you can save the answer till later. But he took the actual metal, whatever he could get his hands on that wasn't still glowing red hot, and what did he do? He hide it? He didn't tell anybody that he was taking it, and just got the hell out?
He took the Mexican, as we'll find out in a little bit, the Mexican soldiers, after they figured out that Willingham was not part of the official U.S. Air Force crash retrieval team,
yes,
that was on its way over there to take over the wreckage and bring it back to the U.S.,
yes,
once they found that out and they started getting really tense and they started displaying their rifles more to him, he and his co-pilot were finally forced to leave the scene. in addition to the fact that their small airplane that they took with them had no lights or radio and was not for night flying, and it was starting to get dark.
Right.
So anyway, these circumstances led to him having to leave. On the way back to their small plane, he just casually bent over and picked up a large chunk of debris, which he wrapped up in his handkerchief. He picked it up with his handkerchief, wrapped it around. It was still warm, but it wasn't red hot, he said. He stuck it in the pocket of his flight jacket, and he took it with him. He then later, as we'll find out later, we'll have some voice clips and more discussion later, he ran a whole battery of tests on that thing, and it proved to be a total unknown. So,
all right, so we're going to play the 31-second long, and just a refresher, this one is going to outline
the debris field.
The debris field. Here we go.
Well, some of them were little pieces. Some of them were big chunks, about as big as a good sofa chair, things like that. So I don't know exactly if it was round or if it was oblong, like some of them. It had skidded through the sand and chamois and everything else down through there looked to me like about 200 or 300 yards. So it was moving on when it hit the ground.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions about that, is that whenever it hit, the speed that it was going and the angle that it was coming down at, whenever it hit, it must have really made an impact area as well, wouldn't it? Absolutely.
Of course, it's important to remember that the object had become very unstable in flight and had started to descend. It had started to slow down and descend prior to hitting the ground. So there was quite a bit of a slowdown factor there before it finally hit. But it did make, according to Colonel Willingham, approximately a 300-yard-long furrow in the ground. And on both sides of that trench that it dug into the ground, on both sides of it were all these fragments of shiny metal just kind of dispersed all over the area. And on the way in, now this is an interesting story. On the way in, Colonel Willingham tells us, it almost took the roof off a house on the Texas side of the Rio Grande River.
Oh, really?
And there was a gentleman working out in his yard, tending his garden, when he saw this streaking fireball come across the sky and nearly clip the top of his roof. And then later on, that gentleman came. He paddled across the river when he saw Willingham and Willingham's co-pilot arrived there at the scene. He paddled across the Rio Grande River, which is very shallow there at that area, and he told them, he wanted to know what the heck that was. We have a clip where Willingham tells that story. It's a 37-second clip we could listen to.
Let's see here.
And then we can discuss that further.
All right, 37 seconds, all loaded, and here it comes.
And where I landed there, the guy across the road over there, he come paddling across the river. I asked him, I said, "Did you see it go in?" He said, "Yeah, I sure did." Said, scared the hell out of me. Said, I was up there in the backyard working, and all at once, here comes this fiery ball down across there. Yeah, he seen me out there looking around and everything, so he come over. I said, "You see it go in?" He said, "Yeah, I did." It like scared me to death when he come over the house there. And I said, "Well, I don't blame you. If it had been 10 feet lower, you probably took the roof off of it."
That's not a good thing.
Imagine if we found that witness. That would really be awesome.
Yes, indeed. Well, let me just ask you both this. In the process of this, were you able to try to find some of the other pilots that were with him at the time that this thing came in, or is it just so difficult because of age and things of that nature?
Well, we haven't as of yet, but something real interesting, Noe and I were going to share about this later, but maybe I could just throw this in real quickly, is that when Noe was mentioned about how we're meeting people, various military people who served in the armed services, we got an email from a gentleman whose father was the commanding general of Carswell Air Force Base back in 1955, and that's when Willingham was stationed there.
Yes.
And what's very interesting, what he shared with us, was that he said that his father was aware of the whole UFO situation there, and that was back in the 60s. So we're going to hopefully connect those folks together, and it was just quite extraordinary that we may have something here to back up further Willingham's experience.
Yes.
An important point here, Jack, is that Colonel Willingham, in our book, in putting together the book based on his eyewitness testimony, he names a lot of names. He gives specific names of individuals who are involved in sighting of this UFO.
Uh-huh.
He gives the names of the persons involved in the debriefing. He gives the names. He mentions specific names, dates, places, things that happened. And we're hoping by getting this information out there that what happened was that after this UFO incident, everybody who was involved in it, the crews from the bombers were not from Texas, and a lot of the personnel in the F-86s were subsequently transferred to other military posts.
Yeah.
And so there was a dispersal of all the witnesses, as often happens in these cases. Colonel Willingham admits that he was not able to keep tabs with a lot of the individuals who were involved in the original incident, and he kind of lost track of them over the course of the years, especially when he was told point blank, as we'll hear in a clip here in a little bit, he was told to never discuss this with anybody, anything related to what he saw or what he experienced that day.
Of course.
So, time went on, time marched on. Colonel Willingham did as he was instructed for many years. He rose up the ranks of the military. He had a very successful career. He was an investigator with Project Blue Book. He went on to rise to the rank of colonel. He was in U.S. military intelligence, carrying out missions for President Lyndon Johnson and later Richard Nixon. He became, he went on to have a highly successful career, which probably would not have been possible if he had come out and spoken to the extent that he has now, what he has revealed in the last year or two about this case. It's unlikely that all of this success would have come to him in the military if he hadn't done as he was told to do, which is to clam up.
Yes, and that is that's in itself, that we could go a lot of different directions with that just itself. But we are at the top of the hour. We're going to take a quick break here, and when we return, we're going to continue listening to some of the audios from Mr. Willingham, and wow, amazing stuff. Stick around. It's Paranormal Radio. It's Friday the 13th, and we're talking UFOs. We'll be right back.
I certainly do.
My guest tonight on this Friday the 13th is Ruben and Noe. Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres. They wrote the book, The Other Roswell. They also wrote the book, Mexico's Roswell. And this has been a very, very interesting case tonight because we have a military pilot that was just in the right place at the right time, saw this thing come in, saw it make a 90-degree turn, saw it crash as he was chasing it, and then went back, encountered Mexican military that had been dispatched to the location to secure it as they awaited a United States crash retrieval team. Because of the plane that he was flying had no lights or no radio, and daylight was quickly running out of time, well, he had to get the heck out of there. And it was by encouragement of the Mexican military officers that were securing the site. And as he left, he decided to take a little bit of it with him. Now, this is just not some guy that could come up with a great story. This guy actually even worked for Project Blue Book. Fascinating stuff. And what we're doing tonight, we're playing some audio clips of the interview of Mr. Willingham. And I gotta say, it's a really cool story. And we're going to dive more deeper into it. And if we have time, we will open up the phone line so you can call in and ask questions about this and anything that I haven't. So, Ruben, Noe, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you,
Captain.
One of the fascinating things about Colonel Willingham is that he has tried over the years, he has brought out little snippets of information about this case over the years.
Yes.
In fact, in 1967, which was only about 12 years after the incident occurred, he was quoted in a local newspaper in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, talking about the UFO that he saw crash near the Texas-Mexico border. And somebody who at that time belonged to NICAP, the civilian UFO watch group in the 60s and 70s, somebody, a NICAP member, clipped that out of the Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania newspaper and sent it to NICAP headquarters in Washington, where it was put in a file and basically forgotten for a number of years, until about 1977, when, quite by accident, I'm sure, a NICAP investigator named Todd Zakel ran across the clipping, and he decided to follow up on it, and so he contacted Colonel Willingham in 1978, found out where he lived and went over there and interviewed him. And the investigation that Todd Zakel conducted in the late 70s became the basis for a 1978 major television documentary that was done by Japanese television, and it was shown in Japan. It became the celebrated UFO case of that year in Japan, because what they were looking for was a good story about a UFO that might have crashed. Well, the Roswell case, when the book Roswell Incident was published, for which Stanton Friedman did the research, and the book was published in 1980, but nobody really knew much about Roswell back in 78. And so when the Japanese came over here looking for a good UFO story involving a crash, Todd Zakel told them about the Willingham case, and lo and behold, that became the case that they did their entire, it was a 30-minute documentary that ran on Japanese television. Ruben and I were very fortunate to run across a copy of the videotape of that, which we have in our possession. And so we know that bits and pieces of this case were already known by UFO investigators as early as 1967. There was a major television documentary done about it in 1978. You know, and people have suggested to us, well, this is an old man who's in his 80s, is practically on his deathbed, and now suddenly he's talking about this UFO. Well, that's certainly not the case.
Yes. Not
the case at all. He had spoken about this. He had tried to, he had related to a number of investigators, and Todd Zakel, the UFO investigator who put this forward in the late 70s, actually had a book that he was preparing about this specific case, although unfortunately he passed away and that book was never published. So I just wanted to clear up that this isn't one of these deathbed confession type stories.
Right.
This has been a burden on Colonel Willingham's mind for many years, and now that he is in his 80s, he finally, very, very lucky for Ruben and myself that we contacted, the timing was just right when we contacted him following up on information we had discovered when we were doing research for our first book, and Colonel Willingham wanted to share, finally, in its entirety for the first time. He wanted to tell the entire story in book form with us, which is something that he unfortunately was never able to do with the previous UFO investigators that he had worked with in the past.
Yes.
So it turned out really well in that respect.
Why do you think that this case never got as much attention as the Roswell case, even though bits and pieces of information about it were coming out long before Roswell ever did? Why didn't it get the attention that it deserved?
That's a real good question. I think we could answer that in a couple of ways. So one of the issues, and Noe mentioned this about the gentleman Todd Zokel, was he was very protective of the information. It was intellectual property rights, and some of the researchers that were aware of this case, he had basically threatened them with lawsuits if they were able to, if they were to continue. On the other hand, when the Roswell incident came out, and back in 1980, I believe, or what was the name of the book? Noe Berlin's book. I forgot the name.
Yeah,
of the
Charles Berlitz's The Roswell Incident.
Mm-hmm.
The research was really done by Friedman, though.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so there. I mean, it was there was a lot more media attention. There were more people that were coming out of the woodwork, more witnesses that were involved. Obviously, a lot more attention, especially now with the media. And so this put this case here in the back, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
No, you may want to also comment some of the other.
Well, it was a number of factors that came in. There was suddenly a lot of attention on the whole Roswell thing because of the, Charles Berlitz was a big-time travel writer, and he had written a book about the Bermuda Triangle, and he had links to a major publisher. And so when he brought out the book, which was really ghost-written in large part by Stanton Friedman, when he brought out the book on the Roswell incident, that just caught on. It just caught the fancy of the media. It was just something that came out right at the right time.
Right.
We had been through the whole Eric von Däniken Chariots of the Gods series of books, and people were really interested in topic. There had been several major UFO sightings. We were in the era of the moon missions and transitioning over to the space shuttle,
yes,
and all that. So, I mean, the timing was just right. The whole Roswell incident exploded, and then this story, which was really kind of being protected by this other UFO investigator, and he was trying to develop it into a book, which he thought was going to kind of blow the lid off the whole thing. It just never materialized, and so therefore the story kind of got shuffled into the background. That's basically part of what happened. There's some other complicated things that happened.
Sure.
Another thing that happened is Willingham never really told the entire story to anyone.
I see.
He was kind of holding back. He was still a bit concerned about repercussions for himself and his family, and so that was another part of it.
Okay. Fair enough. All right, let's see here. We have, let me just take a quick peek here. Now, we have a few other audios here.
I was wondering if you could run one that's 41 seconds in length that has to do with the conduct of the Mexican soldiers at the scene of the UFO crash and what they said to Colonel Willingham.
Yes, let me see if I got the right one queued up here. Bear with me.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't too far for Judge Roy Bean's property. And I walked up there about 100 yards or so, and
let me just stop that. That's not the one, I don't believe. Let me try this next one here. There we go.
I seen where it hit while I was flying, and I told the commander I was going to fly over it and come back, and they said, okay, we want to know what it was. So
Jack, that's not the right one.
Yeah, that's the wrong one.
Well,
are you sure it's 41 seconds long?
Well, it is on my computer. Let me take another quick look at that.
All right.
While we're looking for this one, there's another one that's very relevant here that we can run.
Okay.
For now. It's a 36-second clip that talks about how when he bent over to pick up the piece of debris that he took with him.
Yes. Here, I got that one right here.
Okay.
But he wanted to go with me down there to look where it hit. So we went on down there, and they wouldn't let him down there either. and he was in civilian clothes. And when I found that little piece on the way back, we were walking out of there, and I seen that laying there. I picked it up, and it was still warm. And I told him, I said, we'll just take this along with us, see what it's made out of. I took it out there. I took cutting torch, grinders, and everything else, and it wouldn't even touch it.
Well, then. So
see what he said right there. He took grinders to it. He took a cutting torch, and he was, that metallic substance was withstood all of those tests.
Right.
It was amazingly strong.
That's something. Now, all right. So I'm trying to envision this because he, if he took basically the same risk as the guys that were putting the blankets on the material and then wrapping the blankets around them, because if that stuff is radioactive in any way, or much like what we talked about with Mexico's Roswell, when that Mexican military came in contact with that downed UFO, when they were found, they were all dead, and everyone in the military. So he took a big risk. I mean, this guy loved taking risks back then, didn't he?
Well, once again, it gets back to the fact that he was intensely curious about the whole UFO phenomenon.
Yes.
And he had been for years. He told us that he remembers an incident when he was 9 years old, that somebody in his neighborhood had seen this mysterious airship, is what they called them back in the early 1900s. They called them airships. Uh-huh. And so there was the whole little town where Willingham grew up was abuzz about this report that this gentleman there in town had seen a mysterious glowing circular airship one night. And he remembers that so vividly in his childhood. And then later on, of course, during his military service, during World War II, he had heard about the Foo Fighters, which were buzzing in and out among the U.S. military warplanes in Europe. And then come to the Korean War, and he was starting to hear reports of UFOs being seen all over the United States. You had the wave of UFO activity in the early to mid-50s. So, I mean, it was something that tremendously interested him, and he found himself being a major player in an episode that was unraveling right before his eyes. And he saw it as a possibility where he could grab onto something and actually finally have some evidence in hand of what these strange objects are.
So, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but what happened to the material that he took?
Well, we're getting there. You got a 47-second clip.
All right.
You got a 47-second clip on the metallic fragment in which he describes it and starts to tell us what he did with it.
Play it now?
47, yeah.
All right, here it comes.
It was kind of a yellowish silver. Looked like it's made out of stainless steel, but it had a kind of a yellow tint to it, and it had a bunch of holes on one side of it, and we figured that was to dissipate the heat. This thing was about a half-inch thick, and you could tell it had been broke out of another piece, and you could tell it'd been hot. I guess that's what made it yellow. I just wrapped my handkerchief around and stuck it in my pocket. Yeah, just about the size of a regular man's hand.
So that's a pretty good description of it that he gave there, and the color of it from it being heated, from it coming in.
Yeah, better than a description. He drew an actual painting. That was used in the Japanese television documentary back in 1978, a color painting, drawing, sketch of the object, and we've got it in our book, photographed from several angles, the sketch of this object, and it's really unearthly looking. It really looks, the whole thing with Willingham, both he and his dad were, they had worked with metal all their lives. They had worked in the oil industry. They were both. His dad was actually an oil company metallurgist, and Willingham had learned how to work with metal and use torch welding equipment at a very early age, at about 11 or 12 years of age.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, he knows his metals, and he knew that this metal and this object that had crashed, you know, he told us that he had gotten the sense that there was already a cover story coming down about this being a crashed military missile. But he knew, based on his own background and experience, that this was something other than a missile because of the nature of the metal and what he saw there and the fragment that he picked up.
Yeah, and missiles don't automatically, they don't stay on one course and then suddenly make a 90-degree turn either.
Yeah, and they don't travel at 2,000 miles an hour either.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Huh.
And here's, okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to go into another clip here in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, unless Ruben wants to come in with a comment at this point.
No, go ahead. Maximize the time there with our clips there. You know.
Yeah, so it was getting late, and it was time for them to leave the scene. Now, here's a very interesting and critical point that we've been discussing earlier in the evening, is that the Mexican military had orders to await the arrival of an elite U.S. crash retrieval team.
Yes.
And they were operating by that playbook. Apparently, it had been the case in several other similar retrievals, scenarios that had played out before in Mexico.
Yes.
And this was just another one of them. So you have a voice clip there that is 40 seconds in length, where finally those soldiers got tired of dealing with Willingham and his co-pilot, and so they told him that, or it just became clear to Willingham that it was time for them to leave.
What? Let me ask you this: what voiceover number is it?
That was originally titled Voicer 15.
Voicer 15.
And it's 40 seconds in length.
I got it.
Uh-huh.
All right, let's see here. There we go. Here it comes.
And I told that guy, I said, "You going to take me down there? You going to take me now?" He said, "Yeah, give me one of your cigarettes." I said, "Okay, here." I said, "Just keep the pack." I said, "We get them at 50 cents over there now." Well, he took me on down there, and I got up within about 35, 40 feet of it, and two armed guards come up there and said, "That's close as you can get." I said, "Okay, thank you." Shot him a highball, and it was already get early sundown. I said, "Jack, we better get the hell out of here."
Keep the pack. Very nice.
So you had two factors working there. You had the soldiers who wouldn't let them get any closer than about 35 or 40 feet from the main part of the wreckage. So
Yes.
they weren't obviously not going to let them get any closer.
Right.
Meantime, the sun was going down, and they were stuck with an airplane that had no lights.
Right.
So that was a scenario that was playing out there.
Huh. Well then, okay. So that whenever he went down there, was he in his still in his military gear, or was from flying earlier that day, or did he have to change into civilian clothes?
No, he was still in his flight suit. I mean,
he
he
was.
barely had enough time. Yeah, he was able to get another flight engineer to join him, but he was dressed up in civilian clothing, and so he was able to get that airplane and get it down there as soon as possible, and made us a brilliant. I was just amazed by what he was telling us, that he was able to land that little baby right along the riverbank.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right by the wreckage there.
No
So
kidding.
I think I was one pilot.
To land it and take it off from there.
Yeah, exactly.
Man.
Well, we have to figure that it became obvious to the Mexicans that these two guys, one of which was dressed in civilian clothing, landing this tiny little plane, they certainly did not represent
Yes.
the group that was supposed to come.
Right.
You know,
Right.
they kind of, Willingham and his partner kind of ambled up there, and they didn't really know what was going on, and they were asking questions of the Mexicans, and that led them to believe, hey, these guys are not part of the recovery team.
Yes, indeed.
That we were told to wait for. They're here by themselves. They're operating on their own.
Yes.
So that's when the Mexicans became extremely nervous and started pointing weapons. So we've got the story now of them picking up the piece of metal, and we had, let's see, we had the one that's 22 seconds in length, where Colonel Willingham talks about after they got back to Carswell Air Force Base.
Yes.
He decided that he had tried the cutting torch and the cutters, the grinders and so forth, and nothing was making any headway with his material that he had found at the crash site. So he didn't have the tools for and more analysis.
Right.
Of the metal. So he knew of a right. He knew he needed to get it to a lab, and he knew a certain major that he had run into before during his military years, who worked with a metallurgy lab that was it was a private lab, but it was contracted by the government. By the military, and so he decided to take that metal to him. And there's a clip here that is 22 seconds in length, and then one that goes along with it that's 22 and 18, that tell the story of when he took the metal into the Marine, to the military lab.
Okay, here we go. This is him taking it to the lab.
So we took it up there, and he had got a hold of it and took it to the lab, and he kept looking at it, and he said, boy, I never seen anything like that. And he did the same thing I did. He took a grinder and tried to grind it and everything like that. And he said, man, that's good stuff.
I bet. And then this next one is the disappearance of the metal, I'd assume?
The disappearance of it, that's correct.
All right, here we go.
Yeah, I picked up a piece, and that's when that guy came up from down there, and we flew up and put it in a metallurgist hands up there, and he and the piece of metal both disappeared.
Oh, the technician and the metal disappeared.
Exactly.
And this is a private lab that was contracted by the government for work on metal. Yes.
So the deal is that he left the piece of metal in the possession of these technicians of this lab in Maryland, and he flew back down to Texas. And he left it in their custody, and he was told that they were going to run all sorts of analyses on that. And so he waited a few days, and then he called the major that he knew who worked at that lab. Well, somebody else answered the phone, and he was told over the phone that the major, his contact at this lab, no longer worked there, that he had been assigned elsewhere. And that nobody knew his whereabouts of his new post. And also, by the way, there was no record that anyone could find of Willingham having delivered any sort of metallic fragment to that lab. There had been no test conducted on any such fragment, and nobody knew anything about that. But the really eerie part came a day or so later when he got a phone call from somebody in military intelligence who was making reference to the fact that he had called asking about... Actually, Willingham started to make a fuss with the person on the phone at the lab. He got upset because he wanted to know what had happened and what they had done with that piece of metal. Well, he got a call back saying, we don't want you ever talking to anyone about this metallic object that you supposedly brought to the lab. We've already told you that we have no record of it. Nobody knows anything about it. Don't mention it again.
And is this the audio that's called the cleanup, or is this the don't say one word?
Well, the cleanup audio is the one where he starts to realize that somebody is going around picking up all traces that this incident ever happened.
I see. Okay.
And then the don't say a word audio is what he was told by the people at Carswell Air Force Base regarding the fact that he should not disclose any information about this incident. So we can run the cleanup first and listen to that if you'd like.
All righty, let me cue that up here. Yeah, that's it's interesting that everything will get swallowed up by the the monster of national security, if you will. But here's the cleanup.
No, mostly all I seen were Jeeps and cars. They didn't have nothing to haul that stuff in. But I flew over about 2 weeks later, and there wasn't a thing out there.
So they were able to get all the stuff from where? Well, you know what? Let me a quick question. Where it crashed, what is there now?
It's pretty much the way it was back in 1955. It's just a flat plateau overlooking the Rio Grande River. We've looked at all the satellite imagery. Ruben and I have actually been out there, and we took a bunch of pictures all around the area here a few months back. And so it's a very rugged area of the state. And over on the Mexican side, the nearest village is it's a very small village about 50 or 60 miles away. So nobody lives along the river there on the Mexican side. And on the U.S. side, you've got this tiny little village called LANGTRY, which is basically just what it is it's the State Department of Transportation has set up a tourist center there.
I see.
So, I mean, it's very isolated, kind of isolated. So, yeah, so it's kind of a hard place to get to, and nothing much has changed there.
That's interesting.
In all these years.
Because whenever you guys went out to where you guys had narrowed down where this crash had taken place between the UFO and the plane, you guys were able to find wreckage. So, I always, with this particular case, I wonder, despite how good of a cleanup it might have done, could there still be small fragments buried in the dirt? Or
there might be a possibility, and obviously that would be something for us to go on a future expedition and see if we might be able to find something. And no doubt these earlier, there could have been another further cleanup team that went back there.
True.
But still, there still might be that possibility.
Yes.
What's very interesting is that within 2 weeks, in that last voice clip we heard, Colonel Willingham said he flew over the area within 2 weeks after it happened, and he saw absolutely nothing. The site was totally clean.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, superficially, it's clean. Back in 1978, when the Japanese sent a production crew, a television crew, to film this story for Japanese television, they visited the site again and found absolutely no evidence up above ground.
Yes.
One of the scientists that was contracted by the History Channel for the documentary that we did on the Mexico's Roswell, where Ruben and I were technical advisors for the shoot. One of the crew members, one of the scientists that helped collect samples and do some of the testing on the Chihuahua UFO incident, is very interested. He's contacted us several times, and we've got to get back and link back up with him. But he's very interested in doing some digging at the Willingham UFO site across the border, and to try to locate what could be hidden below ground.
Yes, absolutely.
He wants to run some tests and do other things there, so that is definitely a possibility that we need to look at.
Yeah, because I'm thinking if Willingham was getting out of there because the sun was going down, and those guys were waiting for a retrieval team, you know, who knows how long it might have taken this retrieval team. I mean, they could have been there a few hours after he had left, or, you know, within 24 hours. But during that time, you know, those guys could have been messing with stuff too, or, you know, stuff could have been covered up that is still sitting there under the ground. I mean, that's fascinating information there.
Yeah.
So this last audio is where he's being told to, you know, keep everything on the down low, huh?
Right before we listen to this, I'd like everybody to keep in mind that if you're a member of the military, and you are told in a very strong manner that you face dire consequences if you ever disclose something that's being labeled top secret or whatever the designation is, you know, that's going to impact you tremendously. A lot of us haven't had that experience, but Colonel Willingham to this day remains extremely concerned, and we've been out at his house in North Texas, and it's been at night, and we're interviewing him, or in the afternoon or evening interviewing him, and his eyes will drift over out to past the blinds at his window and out to the front of his house from time to time. It's almost as though, even to this day, there's a question mark there. There's a sense of insecurity. He's not entirely sure. He was told that there would be serious consequences if he ever spoke about this. And even though, you know, he's in his 80s and it's been a long time, there's been many changes of administration, you know, a lot of things have happened. Even so, he remains concerned. And this audio clip you're about to play, kind of brings all of that home, because he listened to what they told him.
Okay.
After his encounter.
All right, here it is.
The reserve unit I belong to, he said everybody's flying on that mission don't say one word about any of it. He told me to keep my mouth shut and be numb about it, or there'd be some consequences. And I said, all right. They said, don't say anything about what you've seen. And he said, if you do, there'll be consequences. And it was.
You know, I saw an article not too long ago that talked about ufologists and even people that have come forward with some information, and there's a very disturbing trend that, well, some guys, they don't live very long, and sometimes their deaths are under mysterious, well, situations, and that's been evident in many cases. So from what he just outlined, from what he just said, you know, you have to really put the seriousness of what was told to him back then in its right place.
Especially during that period when we're dealing with the Cold War, you had all these other issues going on in terms of national security, and of course all the UFO sightings that were happening throughout the country.
Yes. Well,
it's
then.
Certainly something that deeply affected him. He spent a lot of time, you know, worrying about what sort of consequences they might have been talking about. And he made a decision in his mind not to speak about it for years after it happened. And it wasn't until, you know, his first mention of it, because I asked him, did you ever talk to anybody? Did you ever try to find any of those other aviators who were with you on that day? And he basically said that he didn't. It was totally put out of his mind.
Well, whenever he put some information out there, I mean, did he do it anonymously, or how?
No, the very first mention of this, he told us, came in that newspaper article in 1967 in Pennsylvania, what had just happened was the famous Kecksburg UFO crash case.
Yes.
Which, even though he wasn't with Project Blue Book at the time, he was, Colonel Willingham was living in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, only about 20 or 30 miles away from Kecksburg. And he actually went out there. He was still so interested in UFO phenomenon that he actually went out to the Kecksburg area, and he witnessed firsthand the investigation that was being conducted there. So that was, it was in the wake of all the reports that were coming out in that time period after Kecksburg in Pennsylvania, that somebody actually interviewed him in his capacity there as a member of the Civil Air Patrol.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the very first time that he ever spoke about his own UFO incident publicly.
Right.
Well,
So,
and just a brief mention.
You mentioned you may have some people who wanted to talk to us, or anyone on the phone line.
Yeah, let me just throw that out there. If you would like to, ask any questions on this particular thing, we're going to open up the phone lines now. The two numbers to call is either the first-time caller line or the backdoor line. The first-time caller line is 206-973-7836. That's 206-973-7836. Or you can call the backdoor line at 312-239-8902. Either one of those lines will get you in, and you can ask questions to our guest tonight. So what do you, obviously we were talking about this earlier. Whenever you go to these conferences and things, and you talk about these stories, Mexico's Roswell, the other Roswell, you talk about UFOs in general, these guys start coming up to you and they tell you about some of their stories. Can you tell us a little bit of some of the stories that you've gotten? Have any of them kind of filled in some gaps or got you onto the right path in any of your work that you did on these two books?
We have had some feedback that it has been really helpful, and Ruben lately has had a couple of very interesting leads related to the Mexico's Roswell incident that he can talk about. One has to do with a policeman in California whose family was from Coyama, Mexico.
Oh. And
then the other lead that we had was contacting General Montgomery's son. General Montgomery was the base commander of Carswell Air Force Base in 1955 when Willingham had his UFO encounter. So, Ruben, do you want to mention what the breakthrough we had in the...
What I wanted to share on the first, what Noe just mentioned about General Montgomery. I don't know if you remember seeing the movie Strategic Air Command with Jimmy Stewart.
Yes.
Do you recall that? That film was filmed in Carswell Air Force Base in 1955, and the gentleman was sharing with us that his mother was also had a cameo shot in that movie there. So it's going to be real fascinating. The other was I heard this from another radio program. This person was calling in, and he happened to be a police officer, but he was sharing that how his this back in 1974 that he was they were out jackrabbit hunting with his family out there in these remote ranches, and that he remembers seeing an object and then seeing what looked like a figure. And then he talked to his grandmother, and his grandmother said, "Oh yes," he says, I remember seeing something very similar." And then she began to draw the pictures. She drew a sketch of what she saw. And what I find really interesting is that Noe and I had interviewed a number of people there in Coyame over the years, over the past 2 years. But they were sharing with us their recent experiences of sightings, and that and then when the police officer mentioned 1974, well, that's the same year that the object had collided with the airplane.
Yes.
over the Chihuahua Desert. So there's a lot of follow. But as we get into this story, there will be more people coming. Hopefully, we can fit this whole puzzle together.
Absolutely.
Really quite.
Jennifer in New Hampshire wants to know, says, could you please ask your guest how difficult it has been for them to pull military records from that time period, either where they were stationed or where they had served or had been during this time?
Oh, wait. We have to talk about the mysterious fire.
Go ahead, no,
there was a
good one.
It turns out that Colonel Willingham's entire military service records were consumed in some kind of strange fire that occurred at the Military National Records Center
1973.
some years back.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, 1973.
1973 this fire happened?
Yeah. Now, he has copies of a lot of the stuff himself, which he showed us and we scanned.
Yes.
You know, his service record's impeccable. He's a decorated veteran, both in World War II, served under General George Patton.
Right.
And was a, decorated veteran in Korea as well. So, I mean, he has the evidence of his military service that he has on hand, but apparently even his attempts to having to do with his military pension and all of that have all suffered because of the fact that the military mysteriously lost all records pertaining to his years of military service.
Man, those guys, I tell you, they do the same thing. I mean, this hasn't been the first time that they've done things like that of this nature, yes?
Mm-hmm. Oh, what's also interesting in our research, and we came across a declassified document from the National Security Agency where the Air Force all of a sudden became interested right during December of 1955 of a number of B-47 encounters with UFOs. And what's really interesting is that there's about 5 or 6 documented cases where these reconnaissance version, I mean, these planes had specific electronic reconnaissance gear, were able to detect these UFOs following them, and they were very well documented. And what I find quite extraordinary in the time frame where you had Willingham flying escort for a group of B-47 bombers.
Oh, really?
Fascinating, yes. We have that very much covered in our book there.
We had so many incidents during that time period of our bombers that were being followed, circled, run circles around by these UFOs, both in the U.S. and Canada, and just numerous incidents that are in those documents that Ruben's talking about. And so right after the Willingham UFO incident, there was one of the commanders here based in Texas requested all evidence, all documents that the military had in its possession of B-47s being tracked by UFOs. And that has since been released under the Freedom of Information Act, that memo and the subsequent response to it, which was pages and pages and pages of documents about UFO incidents in which B-47s were involved.
Yes.
And, what was really troubling the military at that time was the fact that UFOs were seen in all these highly sensitive areas around the country, where the atomic bomb was under development, where secret military aircraft were being developed, such as a U-2, which, by the way, the U-2 was being developed in Del Rio, Texas, coincidentally.
Really?
And Del Rio was also a place where other secret military aircraft came under development, and surveillance aircraft.
Right.
So that's another interesting angle to it.
Captain, have you seen the movie No Country for Old Men?
Yes. Yes, I have, actually.
Remember the terrain, and that's typical of that kind of
that area, right? That's interesting.
Southwest Texas, Del Rio, and that. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why Del Rio was chosen for the U-2 airplane development, because of the fact it was such a remote location, right in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
There were some underground chambers that were built, and who knows what all those facilities are used for today. I mean, there's still a big Air Force base there that's involved in jet fighter training.
Yes.
In Del Rio, Texas. So that's all part of the picture somehow.
Wild. That is something else. Well, we're quickly running out of time here. You know, see, this program actually is being moved down to Texas here in the next couple of weeks. Actually, I'm going to be broadcasting live from Texas. Actually,
wow,
in a couple of weeks. So right smack dab in the middle. So, you know, all these different aspects to this. And again, this is because of the fact that, I mean, it's from so long ago, from the early 50s, it kind of has the same overtones as, you know, Mexico's Roswell, from your book, Mexico's Roswell, because no one has really dived into it like you both have. They're still developing things with this, or there still can be developing things with this, yes?
Exactly. But one of the things that we were really encouraged about was one of our biggest supporters, as I mentioned earlier, was Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who's a well-known and respected UFO researcher for years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he said was the story of Willingham's life is fascinating even without the crash saucer story. He served in World War II and the Korean War, and for a time was a UFO sighting investigator for the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And then Dr. Maccabee went on to say in the foreword of our book, all of his other life experiences provide the background of credibility for what he has to say about the saucer crash. Adding to that credibility is the investigation done by the authors who have presented his story in a very engaging manner. And then this is the one that really got me, and we really appreciate Dr. Maccabee saying this, and we believe it to be true as well. He said, Dr. Maccabee writes in our foreword, he says, I believe that the reader will find this book important support for the idea that alien flying craft have crashed on Earth and have been retrieved and covered up by the U.S. government. Huh. And that's Dr. Maccabee's words there. We've got a whole bunch more information about this case and other cases that we're working on our website, roswellbooks.com.
Yes.
And people can also pick up a copy of our books there. They can contact us by email. We have voice clips and video clips on our website, a whole bunch of other neat stuff. If people are wanting to know more, roswellbooks.com.
Roswellbooks.com.
Is a place to go.
We're adding that into our web links, as we speak, actually. Roswellbooks.com. Well, you guys, it has been great talking to you again, and I really have a feeling that we're going to have to make this we're going to have to make this story a 3-part series too, because we have not. It's great stuff. I love it. Fantastic. And
I want to quickly put in a shameless plug to have everybody join us at the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico, July 3rd through the 7th for the annual UFO conference that's going on there in Roswell, New Mexico.
That's right.
We'll be presenting the Other Roswell presentation, Mexico's Roswell, and a third presentation there. So we'll look forward to seeing some of your listeners.
Also, if I can, just to dovetail with that too, we're also hosting the 39th International MUFON Conference here in San Jose, California. So for those folks who want to come to a great conference, it's www.mufon.com, and we'll welcome those folks to join us. We had
Stanton Friedman on a few weeks back, and we were talking, and he was actually plugging the Roswell conference coming up for you guys, and saying that you guys are going to be there. And ironically, I just may be there too, as a matter of fact. So
that would be great. I'd love to see you there, Jack.
Yeah, I really hope everything plays out like I want it to, so I can make it. So, well, guys, we're out of time, and fantastic having you on again. Great talking to you both again. Great information as always, and we're going to have to do it again.
Thank you, Captain, and we're looking forward to it.
All right, you guys, you have a good weekend, and I'll give you a shout here next week.
We'll see you soon. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right, good night, guys.
Take care.
There you go. Wild stuff. I absolutely love it. Well, we are out of time, folks. We have come to the end, and if you couldn't get through on the line, sorry about that. They definitely got jammed up. Definitely got jammed up. But a few got screened. Listen, Monday, we got something really cool lined up for you. It's up on the calendar. Just go check it out. It's at the event calendar. The rest of the month has been booked with all our guests, so get up there and take a look at it. But I'm out of here, folks. The week has come to an end, and I've been ready for it. It's been a weird week. And I'm tired, quite frankly. I'm exhausted, but yeah. So that being said, I'll see you later. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.